Hey, I'm Tim Magic Sevenhusen from Oracle'sElixir.com. Recently, the EU LCS stats team, and specifically Ika, who goes by Timbolt as well, released a new set of gold metrics called major lead or deficits. And they put an article on lolesports.com, which you can go read, and I'll put a link to that below. They also put out a video that Dracos presented, presenting it in a bit of a packaged up way. So I want to talk a little bit about this metric, which is something I've been familiar with for a while. And I want to talk about kind of my thoughts on that metric, how I understand it, what it's good at, and then also some issues I have with it and why I don't use it on my site, and why I think there are some other alternatives to it. So first of all, the metric, the major leads and deficits metric, what it is it captures moments throughout the games and measures, of all the gold in the game, what percentage is being held by each team. And if one team is holding at least 51.5% of all the gold in the game, they are considered to have a major lead, and the other team is considered to have a major deficit. And if no team has at least 51.5%, then it's considered to be, an even game. So there are three categories you can fall into at any given time point. You can be in a major deficit, you can be even, or you can be in a major lead. At different points, this was experimented with to have 5 categories instead of 3, so you could have a major deficit, a minor deficit, even minor lead, major lead. But ultimately, they chose to simplify it to 3 categories for this release of the stat. It also used to be based on 52.0% rather than 51.5%. But for reasons that they discussed within the article, they decided to bring it down to 51.5%. And, I don't want to get too much into the specifics of whether I think, which threshold makes more sense. But that's what they chose to do, and how they've moved forward with it. So I want to I want to just understand, first of all, why is this metric, what is it meant to be used for? Why is it being presented like this? And what their stated goals are is that they want to pick a threshold to isolate meaningful leads that have a good predictive power on whether one team is in a really good spot to win the game. They don't want to have the threshold be so high that the game is already decided, that they would still want to capture, a lead that is not a win, that is not effectively a win. But they also don't want it so low that the goal difference doesn't really mean much. So again, they talk about this in the article, and you can go through it and see kind of their reasoning. So what I think this set of stats is good for is helping to see one thing it does better than other gold metrics, such as you've got kind of gold difference at 15 minutes or at different time points. Those only capture a single point in the game, so they aren't measuring the entire game. You've also got gold metrics that capture the end of the game, such as you could measure this, just as at the state the game ends, what was the gold lead of the team, what was the percentage of gold held by the team, or something like gold spend percentage difference, which I have in Oracle's Elixir. Again, those only capture the end of the game, so they don't really measure what happened throughout the game. Did they get a lead? Did they hold the lead all to the end? Did they get a lead and lose the lead? Did they come back from, were they behind and then they came back and brought it even and got ahead and won? So this is a metric that helps to capture the entire flow of the game in some sense. I'm assuming that they're using the set of data that captures the gold amounts at every minute mark. So it'll do it at 0, 1 minute, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, so on up to the end. It is possible to do this second by second. I think that would be kind of unnecessary. It would capture more data, but I think it's not really necessary, and it would also, that data is only available for some leagues and not others, so that'd be kind of self-limiting to do that. So I'm assuming they're using the 1 minute marks to do this. Also, the way they presented some of the data makes it suggests that that's what they've done. I've got some issues with what they've done with this metric, and this is something that I've talked about with them, with Ika in the past, and not in a super detailed way, but kind of raised my thoughts, and he raised his, and I thought it's an interesting discussion. And first of all, I just want to preface this with saying this is not meant to be like a criticism of the stat or the people who created the stat. I think these things are worth discussing and having an open conversation about, and I think it's interesting for other people to hear about those and to have the opportunity to chime in and kind of dig into these nuances. This isn't going to be interesting to everyone, but hopefully to some of you. So I also want to be upfront that I actually used an earlier version of these stats in Oracle's Elixir for a little while before I kind of thought through some of the limitations I thought they had, came up with a different approach, which I can go into a little bit later. So I no longer have them in Oracle's Elixir, but I was quite excited about this concept when it first came out and just kind of moved on from it. So get into the issues I have. First of all, so as a framework for this, usually statistics in League of Legends, and you can generalize this to other contexts as well, but they accomplish one of two main goals. Either they are a stat that measures how well someone does something, so it's something that is, usually like a higher number is better, and you can directly compare two teams, you can directly compare two players or the whole range. So that's goal one. Goal two is a stat that measures in what way someone does something. So these are not, higher is not necessarily better, lower is not necessarily worse. It's more of a measurement of style. So some examples would be measuring how well someone does something. You can take goal difference of 15 minutes or the more comprehensive model early game rating, which also includes dragons and map side and so on. If you've got a higher average goal difference of 15 minutes, that is always better. You always want to be, generating bigger goal leads. You could say KDA is a very simple example. Higher is better. It's not quite that simple. I've made a video on KDA before. It's a very kind of weird number that is biased by a lot of things, and it's, not every death is a bad death and that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, without going into all that mess, a higher KDA is better than a low KDA, and you can compare the two and say, one is better, one is worse. Examples of stats that measure the kind of stylistic stats or in what way someone does something. Kill participation for players. You can kind of say that a higher kill participation is better, but it also helps you measure how that player contributes to the team, especially for someone like a top laner. If they've got a low kill participation, that might mean that they are split pushing a lot, and then you have to look at that and say, are they good at split pushing a lot, or are they generating a lot of value, or is their time away from the team with the team fighting without them, is that good time or bad time? It's not really, you can't say that a low kill participation player, especially a top laner, is performing poorly, and you can't say the one with high is performing well. You have to look at other things, and it kind of gives you some insight into that. For teams, combined kills per minute, very much a stylistic stat. You cannot claim that a team that fights more, that has more kills and deaths per minute on average, is doing better than a team that fights less. It tells you something about the way they play, how often they fight. You could combine that with a kill-to-death ratio, and now you're starting, a kill-to-death ratio is a how well kind of a stat that, having a higher ratio is better, a lower ratio is worse. But these are just different types of stats, and those are the two main goals that stats accomplish. So, circling back to this major leads and deficits stat, you have to ask the question, what is the purpose of this stat? Or rather, of this set of stats, because they'll show you a percentage of time that a team spends with a major lead, percentage of time with a major deficit. Is it a how well stat? Well, sort of. Because you can say, okay, how much time do they spend with the lead? Compare the two teams. One of them spends, 30% of the time with the lead. One of them spends 15% of the time with the lead. 30 is better than 15. You can sort of say that. But you also have to look at the deficit stat. What if a team is spending 30% of the time with the lead and 50% with a deficit, and the other team spending 15% of the time with the lead, but only 5% with a deficit? You can't really say easily which team is better or worse. You're also hiding a ton of nuance by thresholding it at 51.5%. Now you're treating a 51.5% lead as the same as a 53.5% lead and saying that a lead is a lead, it doesn't matter how big, which is not accurate. So if you're trying to treat this as a how well kind of a stat, you're not making it easy to interpret, and you're hiding a lot of nuance by making this into one large category of lead, one large category of deficit, rather than capturing the continuous kind of scale in the middle of that. So you could say maybe this is an in what way kind of a stat instead of a how well stat, where you say, it is a team spending a lot of time with the lead and a lot of time with the deficit? Are they spending a little bit of time with the lead, a little bit of time with the deficit, or something in between the two? And always you're trying to infer the middle category there that isn't actually stated, which is how much time do they spend relatively even in gold. So that you can capture kind of the variance here. Is this a team that spends a lot of time with leads, a lot of time with deficits, so they're very kind of unpredictable and a lot of gold swings in their games, and they either snowball for, they snowball against. And so you're getting a little bit of an in what way kind of a story, but it isn't a very clear story. And in my opinion, you could isolate those stories and find better ways to tell those stories. So a couple other issues, which I've kind of mentioned as well, you have to, when you're looking at this stat, you're looking at two numbers and you're inferring a third that isn't stated. So you're looking at the time with the lead, you're looking at the time with the deficit, and then you've got that invisible number in the middle that isn't stated, and you kind of have to mentally calculate that. So it takes a little bit of effort to read that stat. It's not just, you look at a number, you see it's a big number, it's a small number, whatever it is. The cutoffs for this, the 51.5%, it's kind of awkward to select and it's awkward to defend. As I mentioned, it used to be a 52.0% when this stat was first developed for League of Analytics. Now it's a 51.5%, and there's justification in the article for how they chose what they chose, but the approach to choosing it, whether or not it's the right way, you could always debate which threshold to land at. There is a conversation to be had, and there's no obvious way to determine this is definitely the right way. There's always going to be some level of opinion and subjectivity in that. So it's kind of awkward to do that way. Just the concept of using thresholds or cutoffs in general is going to be awkward because somebody has to make that choice of where the cutoff is. In my opinion, statistics, as often as possible, should take continuous data and use it in a continuous way rather than boxing up continuous data into categories and treating it as categories. You're always going to lose nuance within those categories, and you're going to introduce bias by whoever selected it. Even if you do the best job you can to reduce that bias or to communicate that bias or to make it clear, there's always going to be some level of subjectivity, and that just creates potential issues in the future. There's also another threshold included in here, which I hadn't mentioned yet, but in the Riot approach, they are not using any data past the 40-minute mark in this model. So if you got to 41 minutes or 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and you've got 52 or 53% of the gold in the game, the justification is that at this point people are at or approaching full item builds. The gold differences start to mean less compared to things like champion scaling, map control, dragons, all these kinds of things. So they felt that it just makes things too messy, and they just cut it off at 40 minutes. I have an issue with that because yes, the gold, the absolute differences in gold start to mean less, and once you hit max items, then the gold kind of doesn't mean so much. But in my opinion, it still matters that you've got a gold lead because it means that you either are farming the waves better, which means map control, or you've got more towers down than them, which means more map control. Like I think there are still elements to this that still matter, and you need to have a really, really, really solid argument for just ignoring a chunk of your data, which is just a hard thing to defend doing as a general approach to statistics. It's not that they necessarily made a poor choice in doing so. It's just that it's a very hard thing to justify. And it's cleaner, in my opinion, to leave that data in rather than take it out. I'd like to see the results either way with it in and out. I'm not sure if they actually did that and compared to see how much of a difference it makes. But in my opinion, there is value to rewarding a team for reaching the late game and having a gold lead. If you're at 45 minutes or 50 minutes in the game and you've got a big gold lead, I think, that still counts for something and that still means something, and you should still be rewarded for that statistically, even if it's harder to measure that in actual raw item differences. Generally, in the ultra late game, those percentage differences are going to decrease because you'd have to have a 20,000 gold lead to have a really large percentage of the total gold in the game. And if the gold difference is that big, it does matter. But generally it's going to decrease and your 20,000 gold lead is going to drop to 10 or to 5, in which case the percentage differences are so small that they're not going to shift the overall balance of the end statistics all that much anyways. I just think it's hard to justify for what is probably a relatively small impact on the end results. But now you have introduced a bias of your own by making a choice about the data and what data is valid and not valid. So some alternatives or thoughts, rather than just kind of throwing issues at this, that's never productive. So some alternatives. The stat that I brought in to replace this on Oracle's Elixir when I chose to stop using this was gold percent rating. So what gold percent rating does is it takes similar approach. It measures at each minute mark what percentage of the overall gold in the game is each team holding. So it's going to be 51-49 or 52-48 or whatever it is. But then rather than kind of thresholding a lead and a deficit onto each one, it just averages out that average or that amount of percentage of the game's gold held, and it averages that throughout the entire game and throughout all of the team's games, all the minute marks in all the team's games. Then, just to make it more readable, I center that around 0. And so now if on average a team is holding 51.0% of the gold, I treat that as a plus 1.0. And if a team on average is holding 48% of the gold, I treat that as a minus 2. So centered around the 50% mark, and move the decimal point just to make it easier to read and easier to compare. And I'll usually report it with 2 decimal points, so it'll be like a plus 1.20 or a minus 0.35 or something like that, just to make it easier. And I think there's a lot of variation within that second decimal point that's worth surfacing, worth showing. Why I like GPR better is that it is the goal it is trying to accomplish is very clear. It is very much a how well stat. It's measuring how well does this team generate and hold gold leads. How well do they, earn more gold themselves while preventing their opponents from earning gold. You've got a single number to look at. It's very easy to read and compare between teams. There's no, looking at 2 columns and inferring something in between them. It's one number. It's easy to compare. The story it's telling is very clear. It also is not conflating, data into one category. It's not treating a 51.5% and a 53.5% as the same thing. It's going to measure all the continuous data points between that. Every 1 gold difference is a different data point. And so it's capturing all the variance, all the range, and it's not hiding any of the subtleties of the data. It's taking continuous data, it's treating it as continuous data, and it's generating a continuous output. Not treating continuous data as categorical, which is something that I never really like. So one thing that GPR doesn't do is get at the variance. It doesn't tell that little bit of kind of in what way story that the major leads and deficits stats tell. It's not going to be able to say this team spends a lot of time even, or this team spends a lot of time ahead and a lot of time behind. It's not going to measure all that because it puts it all into a single number. The idea that if you average a 10 and a 0, you're going to get a 5. But if you average a 5 and a 5, you're also going to get a 5. And those two things are different. So we're not able to tell that with this. And you are able to do that a little bit with the major leads and deficits approach. My feeling is if that's a story you want to tell, when that variance matters to you and you're trying to tell that in what way kind of a story, there are other ways to tell that, and there are better and clearer ways to tell that. So you could still do a 2-number approach. If you've got, right now you've got major leads and deficits, you're putting those 2 numbers beside each other. Forget about the fact that we're implying a third one in the middle. You could take gold percent rating, which is basically a mean, an average of the gold percent held, and beside it you could put a standard deviation or some other measurement that captures do they on average have 51.0% and they have a small standard deviation, so they're very, very close to that most of the time, or they have a large standard deviation, so they have a lot of, they're ranged very far around this average. That way you aren't hiding any nuances behind the thresholds. You're still getting a continuous data output, and you're not collapsing things into categories. And you're using a statistical approach that is very well defined. Standard deviations are very common. You still have to rely on the reader or the viewer to understand a standard deviation a little bit. But in my opinion, this level of statistical analysis is always going to be gated a little bit to the audience. Those who have enough statistical interest and knowledge to care a lot about this type of statistical approach are also more likely to have the tools to interpret it. So, I'd use a standard deviation, something like that, if you want to tell that variance story alongside the kind of how well kind of story of the kind of GPR approach, or the how often do they spend time with the lead, that kind of approach. Another way to accomplish some of the goals of the major leagues and deficits approach, where it shows the variance, is to chart things visually rather than condensing things into a percentage. Put things into a visual chart. And so, for example, if you're going to do 10 games or fewer, you could just put that in a line chart. Do a line chart of the goal percents for each game and show kind of the heights and peaks and valleys of it. And that way you can see kind of, they spend a lot of time above the 50% mark, a lot of time below the 50% mark, and you can also see how many peaks and valleys and how big they are. You also get game time if you do it that way. You're getting even more. So do it visually. It makes it really easy to read if you do it well, and you get more nuance. You get all the nuance, in fact, and it's just more effective that way. If you're going to do more than 10 games, it can get really messy. You could do some kind of something similar to like a bell curve style representation where you center the horizontal axis on 50%, and then you say make a lot of kind of smaller categories. Do every 0.2% or something like that. You have a new category and show how often, how many of their data points fall at the center at the 50%, how many of them fall, 0.2% outside of that, and then see where their mean lies. How many of them fall are they most often below, or are they most often above? And you get kind of a bell curve style. It's not going to be normally distributed. It's going to have longer tails. If they do well, it's going to have a longer tail out to the positive end or a longer tail out to the negative end. But then you could overlay those for different teams and compare them that way. That's going to be a little harder for the average viewer to interpret and to know what this is representing, but it would be, I think, a fairly clean visual way to present this information, get at all the nuance you want without kind of condensing it into a single number if you don't like that idea of a single number capturing all of this and having a final individual output. So I think there are a couple of different options of ways to visually present this data or these conclusions that would tell the story better than these percentages. That would be just as easy or easier to read, get at the nuance, not worry about losing all the subtleties of collapsing this into categories. So to sum all of this up, this has just been a whole lot of thoughts thrown out there, but kind of in summary, I think what the EU LCS stats team has done is really cool and interesting, and I'm always happy to see people kind of pushing the envelope on this and being creative, coming up with new numerical stories to tell and new ways to tell them. But in my opinion, the goals of these new metrics aren't clear enough. They aren't sure what they're trying to accomplish exactly, and if you kind of refine those goals and figure out exactly what you are trying to accomplish, I think you'll see that you can achieve those goals in different ways, more clearly and more effectively. Those are my thoughts on this subject. Happy to hear what other people think about it and continue this, and I hope we see a lot more cool new ideas and discussion of this going forward.